We are the most connected generation in human history, and yet loneliness is being called an epidemic. We have more information available to us than any people who have ever lived, and yet deception spreads faster than truth ever could before. We chase success harder than any generation before us, and yet anxiety, burnout, and quiet despair are rising in every country that has it. Something strange is happening. The more we gain, the emptier we feel. The more we connect, the more disconnected we become. And here's the question almost no one is asking. What if someone warned us about exactly this? 2,000 years before smartphones, before social media, before algorithms decided what we think about. What if Jesus of Nazareth, standing on a hillside in a world without electricity, described the exact conditions so many of us are living in right now? Not in vague spiritual language, but in warnings so specific, so psychologically precise, that modern therapists, sociologists, and researchers are only now catching up to what he said. Today, we are going to walk through 15 of those warnings. Some of them will feel uncomfortable. Some will completely change how you see a familiar Bible story. And one of them, the very last one, is arguably the warning modern people ignore more than any other, even though Jesus tied it directly to how he said we'll ultimately be judged. Stay with me, because warning by warning, a pattern is going to emerge. And by the end, you may realize Jesus wasn't just talking to people in the first century, he was talking to you. Warning 1. Let's start somewhere most people don't expect, not with actions, with thoughts. In the middle of his most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said something that shocked his original audience. He said that anger held onto in the heart carries the same spiritual weight as the act of violence itself. And he said the same thing about lustful thinking, that it carries the same weight as the physical act. To an audience raised on a system of visible law, where you were only guilty if you were caught doing something, this was radical. Jesus was saying the real battlefield isn't your behavior, it's your inner life. The thoughts nobody sees, the rehearsed arguments you have with someone in the shower, the bitterness you nurse in silence. Now think about how this applies to a person scrolling through their phone at 11 at night. Nobody sees what you are consuming. Nobody sees the resentment you're feeding, the comparison you're marinating in, the imagined scenarios playing out in your head. Modern culture has convinced us that privacy equals innocence. If no one sees it, it doesn't count. Jesus said the opposite. What happens in private is where your real character is being formed. Psychologists today confirm this in their own language. Rumination, the habit of replaying negative thoughts, is one of the strongest predictors of anxiety and depression, even when a person never acts on a single one of those thoughts. The mind is not a neutral space. It is where the person you're becoming is quietly being built. Jesus wasn't trying to make people feel guilty for having thoughts. He was revealing where transformation actually needs to begin. Here's the sentence worth remembering. Your character is not built in public, it's built in private, thought by thought. And that idea sets up the next warning perfectly, because if your inner life shapes who you are, what happens when that inner life is constantly anxious? Warning 2. Jesus once told a crowd of people, most of whom were one bad harvest away from poverty, not to worry about their lives, not about what they would eat, what they would wear, or how tomorrow would work out. On the surface, this sounds almost naive, easy for someone to say when it's not their family that might go hungry. But look closer at what Jesus actually points to. He points to birds who don't store grain in barns yet are fed. He points to wildflowers that don't labor yet are clothed in a beauty finer than any king's robe. His argument isn't that effort doesn't matter. His argument is that worry adds nothing. He asks directly, who among you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? That question lands differently once you know what modern research shows. Chronic worry doesn't just feel bad. It physically shortens the very life it's trying to protect through elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, and a weakened immune system. Jesus wasn't offering a feel-good platitude. He was identifying a trap that would still be catching people 2,000 years later. Today, the object of worry has just multiplied. It's not only food and clothing anymore, it's whether your post performed well. It's whether you're behind compared to people your age. It's health scares triggered by a symptom you searched at 2 a.m. The scale of things to worry about has expanded far beyond anything a first-century farmer could imagine, which makes this warning more relevant now, not less. Jesus wasn't telling people to stop planning or stop working. He was telling them where not to let their minds live. Here's the sentence worth remembering. Worry doesn't prepare you for tomorrow, it just steals today. But if worry is a thief, Jesus warns next about something even more dangerous, something that doesn't just steal your peace, it can quietly steal your entire life's direction. Warning 3. Jesus said, "You cannot serve two masters. You will end up loving one and hating the other, being devoted to one and despising the other." Then he named the second master directly. Not money itself as evil, but money as a master, as something that competes for the same loyalty God asks for. This is one of the most misunderstood warnings in the entire Bible. People assume Jesus is condemning wealth. He isn't. Several wealthy people in the Gospels are treated with respect. What Jesus condemns is a heart that has been quietly rearranged so that financial gain becomes the actual center of a person's decisions, relationships, and identity. You can tell who your master is, Jesus implies, by watching what you sacrifice everything else for. In a modern economy built on comparison and status, this warning is almost impossible to escape. Career decisions, relationship choices, even how people spend their free time are increasingly organized around the pursuit of more. More income, more assets, more visible success. Sociologists have a name for this now. They call it lifestyle inflation, where no matter how much a person earns, their sense of enough always moves just out of reach. That is precisely the trap Jesus described in language people 2,000 years later still recognize instantly. The warning isn't about the money in your account. It's about what's sitting on the throne of your attention. Here's the sentence worth remembering. You can own money without money owning you, but only if you know which one is actually in charge. And this warning connects directly to the next one, because once money becomes a master, it quietly changes how you look at everyone who has more or less of it than you. Warning 4. Jesus said, "Do not judge, so that you won't be judged yourselves." Then he added a picture almost comedic in its imagery. He asked why someone would try to remove a speck of sawdust from another person's eye while ignoring an entire plank lodged in their own. This warning is often flattened into a vague message of tolerance. But Jesus is making a sharper psychological point. He's saying the harshest judgments we make of others are usually a projection, an exaggerated awareness of a flaw in someone else that mirrors, often unconsciously, a bigger flaw we refuse to examine in ourselves. This is strikingly close to what modern psychology calls projection, where an unacknowledged trait in ourselves is magnified and criticized when we see it in others. Now picture this warning applied to comparison culture. Social media has built an entire economy on judging. Judging appearances, judging choices, judging other people's parenting, relationships, opinions, and success, often from complete strangers who know nothing of the full story behind what they're seeing. Jesus isn't saying discernment is wrong. Elsewhere, he actually calls people to use wise judgment. What he's condemning is a critical posture that ignores your own flaws while magnifying someone else's. It's worth noticing how much lighter people feel after they stop performing judgment and start practicing self-examination instead. Here's the sentence worth remembering. The eye quickest to spot flaws in others is often the one least willing to look inward. This warning naturally leads into the next one, because if we're so quick to misjudge people, Jesus warns we can be just as easily misled by people who are pretending to be something they're not. Warning 5. Jesus warned his followers to watch out for false prophets, people who come dressed like sheep but are actually wolves underneath. Then he gave a simple test. You will recognize them by their fruit. Not by their charisma, not by their confidence, not by how convincingly they speak, by what their teaching actually produces over time. In the ancient world, this warning applied to religious figures claiming spiritual authority, but the underlying principle transcends religion completely. It's about the danger of trusting a confident voice over a track record of consistency and integrity. This warning has never been more relevant than right now. We live in an era where anyone can build an audience, and confidence is often mistaken for credibility. Misinformation researchers have found that the most persuasive spreaders of false information are rarely people who look untrustworthy. They're often the most charismatic, well-produced, emotionally compelling voices in the room. Jesus anticipated this exact vulnerability. He knew that human beings are drawn to charisma, and that charisma alone tells you nothing about whether someone is guiding you toward truth or away from it. His solution wasn't cynicism, treating everyone as a liar. It was patience, watching the fruit, the pattern, the outcomes over time, rather than being swept away by the first impression. Here's the sentence worth remembering. Anyone can sound convincing for 5 minutes, but only consistency reveals the truth over time. And this idea of testing what's real over time sets up one of the most visual warnings Jesus ever gave, about the difference between something that looks solid and something that actually is. Warning. 6. Jesus ended the Sermon on the Mount with a story about two builders. One built his house on rock, one built his house on sand. From the outside, during construction, both houses might have looked identical. Same walls, same roof, same windows. The difference was invisible until the storm came. Rain fell, floods rose, winds battered both houses, and only one was left standing. Jesus said the difference wasn't luck. It was foundation. The wise builder was the one who not only heard his words but put them into practice. The foolish builder heard the same words and did nothing with them. This warning speaks directly into a culture addicted to appearances rather than foundations. It's entirely possible to build a life that looks impressive, a great job title, an active social calendar, a curated image, while the actual foundation underneath, character, discipline, integrity, resilience, has never been tested or developed at all. The problem is, you cannot tell the difference between a rock house and a sand house until pressure arrives. That's exactly why so many people are blindsided by a crisis, a layoff, a diagnosis, a betrayal that reveals a foundation they didn't realize was never actually there. Jesus wasn't warning people to avoid storms. Storms come for everyone, he said so directly. He was warning them to build correctly before the storm arrives, because by the time it does, it's too late to lay a new foundation. Here's the sentence worth remembering. Storms don't create weakness, they only expose the foundation that was already there. This next warning may be the one modern audiences resist the most, because it goes against everything popularity culture teaches us to chase. Warning 7. Jesus said, "The gate that leads to destruction is wide, and the road is easy, and many find it. But the gate that leads to life is narrow. The road is difficult, and only a few find it." This is one of the most uncomfortable statements Jesus ever made, because it directly contradicts a very modern assumption. The assumption that if something is popular, it must be right, and if something is unpopular, it must be wrong. Jesus flipped that logic entirely. He suggests that the crowd, by default, tends to drift toward what is easy, comfortable, and immediately gratifying, not necessarily toward what is wise or good. This isn't elitism. It's an observation about human nature that behavioral scientists now describe using terms like social proof and conformity bias, our deep tendency to assume the majority must know something we don't, even when the majority is simply following the path of least resistance. Apply this to modern decision-making. Career paths, spending habits, relationship patterns, even moral convictions are often shaped more by what's common than by what's actually wise. Going against the crowd feels isolating, which is exactly why Jesus described the narrow path as one only a few find, not because truth is scarce, but because the discipline required to walk against convenience is rare. Here's the sentence worth remembering. Just because a road is crowded doesn't mean it's headed somewhere good. But here's where the next warning gets even more uncomfortable, because Jesus doesn't just talk about paths people choose, he talks about wounds people refuse to let go of. Warning EIJ. Jesus told a story about a servant who owed his king an amount of money so enormous it could never realistically be repaid. Yet when he begged for mercy, the king forgave the entire debt. Moments later, that same servant found a fellow servant who owed him a small amount by comparison, and instead of extending the same mercy he'd just received, he had the man thrown into prison until he could pay. When the king heard about it, he was furious and reinstated the original, massive debt. Jesus' point is direct and unsettling. Unforgiveness is often a failure to recognize how much we ourselves have already been forgiven. This warning speaks straight into modern relationships. Family rifts that last decades, friendships ended over a single conflict, grudges people carry so long they forget the original offense but keep the resentment alive out of habit. Clinical research on forgiveness has found something remarkable, that people who hold on to resentment show elevated stress markers, and letting go of a grudge is associated with measurable improvements in both mental and physical health. Jesus wasn't asking people to pretend they weren't hurt. He was warning that unforgiveness doesn't punish the other person nearly as much as it imprisons the one holding on to it. The servant in the story wasn't freed by his anger, he was condemned by it. Here's the sentence worth remembering. Refusing to forgive doesn't lock the other person out, it locks you in. This next warning is where Jesus goes after something even more hidden than a grudge, the quiet pride we don't even realize we're carrying. Warning 9. Jesus told a story about two men who went to pray. One was a religious leader who thanked God that he wasn't like other, lesser people, listing off his own good deeds with visible satisfaction. The other was a man widely despised in his community, who wouldn't even lift his eyes toward heaven and simply asked for mercy, calling himself a sinner. Jesus said it was the second man, not the first, who left right with God. This story dismantled the assumptions of its original audience because the religious leader looked, by every visible standard, like the more spiritual person. Jesus' warning here is about a very specific danger, the pride that hides inside apparent goodness. It's not simply the pride of arrogance, it's the subtler pride of comparison, feeling secure not because of who you are, but because of who you're better than. This maps almost perfectly onto how curated self-presentation works today. Highlight reels, achievement posts, humble brags are often less about genuine celebration and more about quiet positioning, an unconscious version of the very prayer Jesus condemned, "Thank you that I'm not like them." Researchers studying social comparison have found that the more people measure their worth against others, the lower their long-term well-being tends to be, regardless of how favorably that comparison turns out. Jesus' warning wasn't against confidence. It was against a security built on being above someone else instead of being honest about yourself. Here's the sentence worth remembering. The moment you feel superior to someone, you've already lost the humility that made you worth admiring in the first place. And pride like this often has a close companion, an appetite for more that Jesus warns can quietly take over an entire life. Warning. 10. Jesus told a story about a wealthy farmer whose land produced such an abundant harvest that his existing barns couldn't hold it all. So he made a plan, tear down the small barns, build bigger ones, and finally, relax, eat, drink, and enjoy life. That very night, Jesus said, the man's life was demanded of him, and all that accumulated wealth passed to someone else entirely. Jesus called him a fool, not because wealth is foolish, but because the man had organized his entire identity and security around accumulation, while never once considering the one variable he couldn't control, time. This warning is strikingly relevant to what modern behavioral economists call the hedonic treadmill, the pattern where each new acquisition provides only a temporary lift in happiness before the baseline resets and the pursuit of more begins again. Consumerism thrives on this exact psychological loop. Bigger barns, bigger houses, bigger followings, each one promising the arrival point will finally bring peace, and each one failing to deliver it once you get there. Jesus wasn't condemning ambition or planning for the future. He was condemning a life so consumed with accumulation that the soul itself was left completely unattended until it was too late to change course. Here's the sentence worth remembering. You can spend your whole life building bigger barns and still die with an empty soul. This idea that outward abundance can mask inward emptiness leads directly into one of Jesus's most piercing warnings about people who look good on the outside while hiding something very different underneath. A warning. 11. Jesus once compared a group of religious leaders to whitewashed tombs. On the outside, he said, they look clean and beautiful, but inside they are full of decay. This was one of his harshest public statements, aimed specifically at hypocrisy, the gap between an outward performance of goodness and an inward reality that contradicts it. Notice Jesus wasn't warning against imperfection. Every person in his audience was imperfect, himself excluded. He was warning against the specific practice of curating an image so convincing that it hides rather than reflects who a person actually is. This warning has an almost uncanny relevance to a culture built on profiles, personas, and carefully edited self-presentation. It's entirely possible now to build a public image that bears very little resemblance to your private reality, and to maintain that gap for years without anyone noticing. Psychologists describe the toll of this gap using the term cognitive dissonance, the mental strain that builds when your outward presentation and inward reality are consistently out of alignment. That strain doesn't disappear just because no one else can see it. Jesus' warning wasn't a call for public confession of every flaw. It was a call for integrity, for the inside and outside of a person's life to actually match. Here's the sentence worth remembering. A beautiful exterior can't compensate for what's decaying on the inside. It can only hide it for a while. This warning about hidden decay sets up one of the most direct and challenging questions Jesus ever asked, one that cuts straight through the idea of success itself. Warning 12. Jesus asked a question that has echoed for 2,000 years. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet lose their very self in the process? This wasn't a rhetorical flourish. It was a warning aimed at ambition itself, specifically the kind of ambition that treats a person's inner life, their character, relationships, and integrity, as an acceptable cost for outward achievement. Jesus isn't condemning success, he's condemning the trade, gaining everything external while losing something internal that can't easily be rebuilt once it's gone. Modern culture is full of stories that echo this exact warning. People who reached extraordinary levels of career success while their marriages, health, and sense of identity quietly collapsed in the background. Burnout researchers describe this pattern almost word for word. High achievers who built impressive outward lives while reporting a growing sense of emptiness, disconnection, and loss of self underneath the achievement. Jesus' question forces a kind of audit most people avoid. What exactly am I trading, and is the thing I'm gaining actually worth what I'm losing to get it? Here's the sentence worth remembering. It's possible to win at life by every visible measure and still lose the one thing that mattered most, yourself. This next warning gets even more specific because Jesus points directly at the thing that determines what kind of person you're becoming, what you choose to feed your attention. Arning 13. Jesus said the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light, but if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. This is one of the most overlooked warnings in the Gospels because it sounds abstract until you translate it into modern terms. Jesus is describing input. What you allow into your attention shapes what fills your inner life. Whatever you consistently look at, consume, and dwell on becomes the lens through which you see everything else. This is remarkably close to what neuroscientists now understand about attention and neuroplasticity. The brain physically reshapes itself around what it repeatedly focuses on, for better or worse. Now consider how much of daily life is dictated by algorithmic feeds engineered specifically to capture and hold attention, often by exploiting outrage, comparison, or fear, because those emotions keep people scrolling longer. Jesus' warning here isn't about screens, obviously, but the principle transfers directly. What you feed your eyes and your attention isn't a neutral choice. It's slowly determining whether your inner world is filled with light or darkness. Here's the sentence worth remembering. You cannot consistently feed your mind darkness and expect your life to be full of light. This next warning is one of the most misunderstood in all of Scripture, and it directly addresses something almost everyone struggles with: fear of taking a risk. Warning 14. Jesus told a story about a wealthy man who, before leaving on a journey, entrusted his servants with money to manage, giving different amounts to each based on their ability. 2 of the servants took what they were given and invested it, doubling their master's money. The 3rd servant, afraid of failing or losing what he'd been given, buried it in the ground instead and simply returned the exact same amount when his master came back. Jesus said the master praised the 2 who took the risk and rebuked the one who let fear paralyze him completely. This warning is often reduced to a lesson about money, but the deeper warning is about fear-driven inaction, the paralysis that comes from being so afraid of failure or loss that you choose to risk nothing at all and end up producing nothing at all. The buried servant didn't lose the money through bad decisions. He lost the opportunity entirely by refusing to make any decision. This maps directly onto modern decision paralysis, people staying in situations that no longer serve them, avoiding opportunities, relationships, or changes, not because they lack ability, but because fear of the wrong outcome feels safer than the discomfort of trying. Jesus' warning is that burying your potential out of fear isn't neutral, it isn't safe, it's actually its own kind of failure. Here's the sentence worth remembering. Playing it safe with what you've been given can be its own quiet way of wasting it. And now we arrive at the 15th warning, the one that ties every previous warning together, and quite possibly the one modern people ignore more than any other. Arning 15. Jesus described a final scene where all people are gathered and separated into 2 groups, much like a shepherd separating sheep from goats. The dividing line wasn't religious performance, correct theology, or public reputation. It was something almost shockingly simple. Whether or not they had fed the hungry, given water to the thirsty, welcomed the stranger, clothed the person in need, or visited the sick and imprisoned. And here's the detail that stunned even his own listeners. Both groups asked the same question back. When did we see you like this? Jesus' answer was direct. Whatever you did or failed to do for the least significant person around you, you did or failed to do for me. This is arguably the most ignored of all 15 warnings because it doesn't ask for a grand gesture, a public statement, or a dramatic act of faith. It asks for something quieter and, in many ways, harder, actually noticing the person easy to overlook. In a world of infinite scrolling and curated attention, the person in front of you, a struggling coworker, a lonely neighbor, a family member who needs a call, is often the easiest person to ignore precisely because they don't demand your attention the way a screen does. Jesus' warning is that indifference toward the overlooked isn't a small oversight. He treats it as the defining measure of a life. Here's the sentence worth remembering. How you treat the person no one else is paying attention to may be the truest measure of who you actually are. Conclusion. 15 warnings. 15 mirrors held up to modern life by someone who lived 2,000 years before any of it existed. A warning about the private thoughts we think no one can see. A warning about the worry that steals today while promising to prepare us for tomorrow. A warning about which master actually holds our loyalty. A warning about the judgment we hand out while ignoring our own flaws. A warning about mistaking confidence for truth. A warning about foundations that can't be seen until the storm arrives. A warning about a crowded road that isn't necessarily headed anywhere good. A warning about the grudges that imprison us more than the people we're holding them against. A warning about the pride that hides inside comparison. A warning about barns that keep getting bigger while the soul goes unattended. A warning about the gap between our image and our reality. A warning about gaining the whole world and losing ourselves in the process. A warning about what we feed our attention. A warning about the fear that paralyzes us into wasting what we've been given. And a final warning about the overlooked person standing right in front of us. Jesus didn't give these warnings to frighten anyone. He gave them because he understood something true about human nature that hasn't changed in 2,000 years, that we are remarkably good at deceiving ourselves and remarkably in need of someone willing to tell us the truth. Every warning here wasn't a threat. It was an act of guidance from someone who wanted people to actually find the life he kept describing as full, abundant, and free. So here's a question worth sitting with after this video ends. Out of all 15 warnings, which one challenged you the most? Which one describes something you recognized a little too clearly? Let me know in the comments, because these conversations are exactly why this channel exists. And if this video gave you something worth thinking about, consider subscribing, because we'll keep exploring the timeless wisdom hiding in plain sight throughout Scripture. 2,000 years ago, someone described exactly what it would feel like to live in your world long before your world existed. The only remaining question is whether you'll do anything about it.